In the beginning of the 21st century, there was a realization that this is not about merchandising at its core. How many toys can you sell? But actually it's about characters that are beloved around the world by a whole hell of a lot of people who really give a damn. And that the audience had become a little bit too sophisticated to simply make fun of their superheroes, and the dawning finally that it did matter. The transition to the point that was like a godsend, where an independent filmmaker who happened to have a passion for a character and a love for a character, even though he did not have endless credits for huge studio pictures, was allowed to express his vision for it and execute his vision in full support by the studio and everyone involved. The bar would be raised so high that all of a sudden, and something that was always unheard of, audiences could walk out of a movie based on a comic book, based on a superhero, and instead of saying, that was a great superhero movie, that was a great comic book movie, at last what they could say, that was a great film.
As a man, I'm flesh and blood. I can be ignored, I can be destroyed, but as a symbol, I can be everlasting.
When Batman Begins came out, the whole idea of rebooting a franchise with a new director and new actors and a whole new creative approach was kind of unheard of.
Relaunching an established franchise, you know, it was definitely a jump off of a cliff. It was, you know, an attempt to say, you know, we're going to kind of pretend that these movies that made hundreds of millions of dollars and were seen by people all around the world didn't exist, and start from scratch.
And I think that they could have gone one of two ways. Way one was, you know, let's play it safe. And way two was, let's just completely and totally entrust somebody to take this and make it their own.
I think the first time I heard that Warner Brothers was interested in making a Batman film, Chris was sort of looking around for something to do, and his agent called me and said, Warner's is looking to make another Batman film, and I was like, I don't think there's any world in which Chris would be interested in that. Because my reference for the movies were the previous ones, and I just didn't really see that Chris would have any interest in doing that. I just mentioned it in passing to Chris, hey, you know, Dan Cool, he was saying this, and I didn't think that was anything for you, right? And he was like, no, that's really exciting, because I've always thought there was a Batman story that hasn't been told on film.
Batman was a project that we were waiting for the right time and the right elements to come together.
When I went in and talked to them about it, it was very open. And that's a great opportunity, particularly for a writer-director.
Chris came in and said, look, you know, this is what I want to do in the movie. This is what I want to do with it visually. This is where I think the character needs to go. I think it's going to be different than any superhero movie anybody's seen before. And what I really want to do is like take that genre and embrace it as a real film genre.
I immediately started talking to them about the origin story.
I know the rage that drives you, that impossible anger strangling the grief until the memory of your loved one is just poison in your veins.
They felt that there was a great little gap there in pop culture terms, particularly because the origin story, it wasn't addressed in Tim Burton's film, but it also wasn't really addressed in the comics.
The pitch that Chris had was so, it was quick. It was 10 or 15 minutes, but it was so holistic. And it really was Batman Begins.
And you know, I looked at Chris and said, okay, thanks, man. You know, appreciate your coming in. And I said, let me talk to Alan for a couple minutes. And we looked at each other and I said, look, you know, if you're gonna back a guy off a pitch, I think this is a guy to do it with. And Alan Horn greenlit the movie off of that pitch.
I think Warner Brothers took a huge chance by going with Chris. Not that he doesn't have the skill set, obviously, to do something like this, but I'm sure the first inclination was to go with somebody who had proven that they could do a $100 million or $200 million movie.
Chris, at that point, had only really made 3 feature films. You have to hand it to the Suits for saying, well, I'd rather go with someone who has absolute clarity and confidence in what they're doing. Here's exactly what it's going to look like. Here's how I want to cast it. Here's how I want it to feel. Here's how I want it to sound. Than someone who's basically just going to sit at the table and give us exactly what we expect. Because we tried that before, and it didn't really work.
I never experienced any hesitation of should we do Batman with Chris Nolan. There was zero hesitation. There was a time after Batman Begins was finished, I remember it, and we saw the movie, that someone said, God, this movie's incredible, this is unbelievable, this is so great, the movie's gonna be such a huge hit. Can you imagine if this hadn't worked? And can you imagine if we rebooted Batman and it wasn't good? And I realized it was the first time that it had ever been brought up. Everything was just pure optimism.
To hear that Christopher Nolan was doing it, that made me very excited. Much more so than if a director who was known for doing fantasy films had picked up the franchise and run with it. He's not the usual suspect. He's not a guy who's so wedded to the comics that he's going to do a literal interpretation of that, which is going to be pretty dull.
All his movies up to that point were about moral choice. They were about characters in extreme moral situations. They were labyrinths of interconnecting memories and interconnecting set pieces that built in a way that was almost mathematical, but if you would, they were emotional mathematics, which is unique to Chris. And that was really interesting to think that this genre, this myth, would be tackled by somebody that was an emotional mathematician, in a way.
Well, I think one of the things that makes Chris unique is that he respects the script so much, and I don't think he'll get into a project or start filming until the screenplay is just right.
At the core of it, there's still a really great story, and then when you dress it with all that other cool stuff, then that makes it a million times better, as opposed to just being either an empty movie with a bunch of gadgets and special effects, or the opposite, which is just a heavy story and not enough of the gadgets or the special effects.
The studio were actually very excited by what they heard Chris talk about, really presenting an origin story for the character. They seemed to be completely on board with that. What I think was a little challenging probably for the studio more than the film that we were making was the fact that we were saying to them, well, yes, we understand that you need to make your lunch boxes, but you have to be really careful with that, and really we need to be leading with the movie first, and that stuff needs to come later. Chris and I had many conversations with the studio about the fact that we really needed to be treating the film as the thing.
For us, it was really simple. We weren't making a movie necessarily to drive consumer products. Even to the extent that we weren't really making a Batman movie, we were making a Chris Nolan movie.